Thunder shook the windows of the imposing mansion, nestled in Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains, while heavy raindrops violently pummeled the colonial roof. Richard Harrison carefully steered his Porsche Cayenne along the winding road leading to his estate, fingers drumming nervously on the leather steering wheel. At 58, the real estate mogul had built an empire, but felt the weight of loneliness in every empty room of his luxurious residence. The business trip to Chicago had been exhausting. 3 days of endless meetings to finalize the purchase of a strategic oceanfront property in North Carolina. The next development would be grand, a high-end residential complex with ocean views, another success to add to his extensive portfolio. When he finally passed through the automatic gates of his property, Richard noticed something different. The porch lights were on, and Martha, his housekeeper of over 2 decades, appeared agitated, gesturing from the main door. He parked under the garage awning and, shielding himself from the rain with his Italian suit jacket, ran to the entrance. "Mr. Harrison, I'm sorry to bother you as soon as you arrive, but," Martha began, twisting her apron between her fingers, "we have a delicate situation." Before she could continue, a baby's cry echoed through the entrance hall, making Richard furrow his brow. There, seated on the Victorian sofa that decorated the space, was a young woman completely drenched. Her dark brown hair dripped water onto the Persian rug, and in her arms, a small bundle squirmed. "What is the meaning of this, Martha?" Richard questioned, his deep voice revealing a mixture of irritation and curiosity. "The young lady appeared an hour ago, sir. She was walking in the rain with the baby. Her car broke down a few miles down the road. I couldn't leave them out there in this storm." The young woman stood up, revealing a simple dress that clung to her body from the rain. Her green eyes conveyed a mixture of desperation and determination that, for some inexplicable reason, stirred a strange feeling in Richard. "My name is Emily Parker," she introduced herself, her melodious voice contrasting with the roar of thunder. "I'm a music teacher, or was until last month. I was heading to my aunt's house when my car simply stopped. I tried to call for a tow truck, but there's no cell signal in this storm. Please, we just need shelter until the rain passes." Richard observed the scene with suspicion. Years in the business world had taught him to be cautious with moving stories and requests for help. But there was something in the way the young woman held the baby, instinctively protecting it, that touched a long dormant chord in his heart. "Martha, prepare the first-floor guest room," he ordered, surprising even himself with the decision, "and provide dry clothes for Miss Parker and the baby." Emily's face lit up with a grateful smile, while Martha quickly headed for the stairs. Richard removed his wet jacket and loosened his tie, trying to ignore the strange premonition beginning to form in his mind. "How many months is the baby?" he asked, more to fill the awkward silence that had settled than out of genuine interest. 4 months, Emily replied, adjusting the small bundle in her arms. "His name is Michael." For a brief moment, the baby opened his eyes, and Richard felt an inexplicable connection with the small being. There was something familiar in that gaze, something he couldn't define, but that deeply disturbed him. "I'll ask Martha to prepare something warm for you to eat," he said, trying to maintain the professional composure that characterized him. "Tomorrow morning, once the storm passes, I'll arrange for a mechanic to check your car." Emily nodded, following Martha up the stairs. Richard remained in the hall, watching them disappear down the first-floor corridor. The rain continued to fall mercilessly outside, but inside his mind a different storm was beginning to form. He made his way to his office, poured himself a generous measure of whiskey, and sat in his leather armchair. The office, his private refuge since he was widowed 5 years ago, now seemed different. The noble wood-paneled walls, which had always brought him comfort, seemed to harbor secrets he didn't know. As he slowly sipped his drink, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that this night marked the beginning of something much larger than a simple twist of fate. The unexpected arrival of Emily and Michael seemed to have been carefully orchestrated by destiny, like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't yet comprehend. The storm persisted for 3 days, transforming Emily and Michael's temporary stay into something more prolonged. Richard, initially reserved, began to notice subtle changes in his solitary routine. The occasional cry of the baby echoing through the corridors, the soft melodies Emily sang to lull Michael to sleep, even the different aroma of coffee in the morning, of this began to awaken long-dormant sensations. During breakfast on the third day, Richard discreetly observed as Emily fed Michael. There was a delicacy in her gestures, a dedication that intrigued him. For the first time in years, the dining table didn't seem so large and empty. "So you mentioned you were a music teacher," Richard commented, breaking the habitual silence. "Why did you leave the profession?" Emily raised her eyes from the baby, and for an instant Richard noticed a shadow pass over her face. "Circumstances changed," she answered vaguely, returning her attention to Michael. "Sometimes life takes us down unexpected paths." Martha, who was serving more coffee, cast a curious glance at Emily. Richard noticed that his housekeeper had seemed uneasy since the arrival of their guests, as if trying to remember something important. "And where exactly were you heading?" Richard continued, his businessman's instinct alerting him to inconsistencies in Emily's story. "To Asheville," she promptly replied. "My aunt has a house there. I thought it would be a good place to start over." Richard nodded, but something in her tone of voice disturbed him. In his years of negotiations, he had learned to identify when someone wasn't being completely honest. Emily spoke naturally, but her eyes revealed greater complexity. After breakfast, Richard retreated to his office, immersing himself in a pile of documents requiring his attention. However, his concentration was constantly interrupted by sounds coming from upstairs. Emily humming a melody that seemed strangely familiar. Late in the afternoon, while reviewing some contracts, he was surprised by a soft knock at the door. Emily stood at the entrance, Michael sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Sorry to interrupt," she said softly, "but I thought you'd like to know the weather is improving. Perhaps tomorrow we can check on my car." Richard stood up, approaching the window. The sky was still overcast, but the rain had diminished to a fine drizzle. For some reason he couldn't explain, the prospect of Emily and Michael's departure bothered him. "There's no rush," he found himself saying, surprising himself. "The weather still isn't entirely safe for traveling with a baby." A discreet smile appeared on Emily's lips, and she adjusted Michael in her arms. It was then that Richard noticed something curious, a small golden locket hanging from her neck, partially hidden by the collar of her blouse. For a moment, he had the impression he had seen that jewel before. "Thank you for your hospitality," Emily said, turning to leave. "It means a lot to us." When she left, Richard remained thoughtful, looking at the door. There was something about that young woman's presence that awakened memories and sensations he had preferred to keep dormant since his wife's departure. The mansion, which for so long had served only as a luxurious refuge from his loneliness, was beginning to take on a different atmosphere. That night, as he walked the silent corridors before retiring, Richard stopped in front of the guest room. The door was ajar, and he could see Emily sitting near the improvised crib, her silhouette outlined by the soft light of the bedside lamp. She was humming a lullaby softly, and for a moment, Richard felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years. However, when he was about to move away, he noticed something that made him freeze. On the dresser, partially covered by a scarf, was an envelope with what appeared to be his company's letterhead. The sight deeply disturbed him. How had that envelope gotten there? And why would Emily have it in her possession? Richard silently backed away, his mind now in turmoil. Years of business experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and something told him there was much more to Emily's story than a simple music teacher looking for a fresh start. The question was, what exactly was she hiding? Michael's persistent crying echoed through the corridors of the mansion in the early hours. Richard, who was still in his office analyzing documents, felt a growing unease. It was past midnight, and the baby, usually so calm, seemed inconsolable. After a few minutes of hesitation, he decided to check if everything was all right. He climbed the stairs silently, his steps muffled by the thick carpet. As he approached the guest room, the crying diminished, replaced by a whispered voice. Richard approached the slightly open door, ready to knock, when something stopped him. "Yes, everything is going according to plan," Emily was speaking on, the phone in a low, controlled tone, very different from her usual melodious voice. "The old man is exactly as we expected. No, I haven't gained access to the safe yet, but I already have the detailed plans of the mansion. Richard felt his blood run cold. Paralyzed by the door, he observed Emily moving around the room, spreading various documents on the bed. Under the soft light of the bedside lamp, he recognized photographs of himself, newspaper clippings about his enterprises, and, more alarmingly, architectural plans of his property that should have been locked in his office. The security system is more complex than we anticipated, she continued, methodically organizing the papers. But I've already identified the weak points. I need a few more weeks to fully gain his trust. At that moment, Michael let out a small moan, and Emily quickly turned to the crib. I need to hang up. The baby is waking up, she whispered, ending the call. Richard silently backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. Years of experience in the corporate world had taught him to remain calm in critical situations, and now this skill would be more necessary than ever. Instead of confronting her immediately, he decided to observe and gather more information. The next morning, during breakfast, Emily seemed more animated than usual. "Mr. Harrison, I've prepared a surprise to thank you for your hospitality," she announced while feeding Michael. "I know it's not much, but I'd like to present something special at dinner tonight." Richard maintained his neutral expression, although his mind was working frantically. "How kind of you, Emily. It will be my pleasure." Martha, who was serving coffee, cast an intrigued look at Emily. The housekeeper seemed increasingly uneasy with the young woman's presence, as if trying to recall something important that remained in the shadows of her memory. Throughout the day, Richard remained in his office, apparently absorbed in his business, but in reality, carefully planning his next steps. Through the security cameras, he observed Emily moving around the mansion. Her gestures were too precise for someone who had been there for just a few days. She seemed to know the house as if she had been there before. In the early afternoon, while Emily was in the garden with Michael, Richard took the opportunity to examine the guest room. He didn't find the documents he had seen the night before, but discovered hidden in the back of a drawer a notebook with detailed notes about his routine, his habits, and, more disturbingly, precise information about his business that wasn't public knowledge. During dinner, Emily served an elaborate pasta dish, claiming it was a family recipe. "My Italian grandmother taught me," she explained, serving the wine. "It's a tradition passed down from generation to generation." Richard observed as she served the glasses, noting how her movements were elegant and confident, very different from the frightened young woman who had arrived during the storm. "Fascinating," he commented, tasting the wine. "You seem to have many hidden talents, Emily." For a brief moment, something passed through her eyes, concern perhaps, but was quickly replaced by a warm smile. "Life teaches us to develop different skills," she replied enigmatically. The conversation flowed surprisingly well during dinner. Emily spoke about classical music with deep knowledge, demonstrating a refined education that contrasted with the simple story she had told. At one point, she casually mentioned an obscure Russian composer who, Richard knew, was his late wife's favorite. "It's impressive how much you know about music," he commented, studying her reactions. "You must have attended a prestigious conservatory." Emily hesitated for an instant before answering. "Actually, I learned a lot on my own. I've always been a dedicated self-learner." After dinner, when Emily retired to put Michael to sleep, Richard remained in the dining room contemplating his wine glass. Martha approached to collect the plates. "Sir," she said in a low voice, "there's something about this girl that bothers me. I know I've seen her before, but I can't remember. Where?" Richard observed his housekeeper with renewed interest. Martha had always had an excellent sense of observation, and her intuition rarely failed. "Keep observing, Martha. Anything you remember could be important." That night in his office, Richard initiated a thorough investigation. He called some contacts, requesting information about Emily Parker. While awaiting the first results, he contemplated the photo of his late wife on the desk. For some inexplicable reason, he had the sensation that she was trying to tell him something across. The following days transformed the mansion into a silent stage, where an elaborate chess game unfolded. Richard, maintaining his facade of a cordial host, began to weave a web of small traps to test his mysterious guest. False information was strategically left in his office. Fabricated telephone conversations were conducted loudly and carefully. Altered documents were forgotten in specific places. Emily, for her part, seemed to dance gracefully between these traps, always maintaining her character of a grateful young mother. However, Richard noticed how her green eyes occasionally sparkled with knowledge. That went far beyond her superficial story. On a particularly sunny morning during breakfast, Richard decided to cast his first significant bait. "You know, Emily, I've been thinking about your situation," he began, watching her carefully over his newspaper. "I have a property in Luxembourg that needs a cultural administrator. Someone with your musical knowledge would be perfect for the position." Emily's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, an almost imperceptible hesitation. "Luxembourg? How interesting. I didn't know you had properties in Europe." "I keep it discreet," Richard replied, knowing that no such property existed. "It's an old castle that I've transformed into a cultural center. Very few people know about it." That same afternoon, through the security cameras, Richard observed Emily on her personal computer, intensely researching properties in Luxembourg. Her searches were methodical and professional, very different from what one would expect from a simple music teacher. Martha, who was serving afternoon tea in the office, seemed increasingly agitated. "Sir, last night, when I passed by her room, I heard her speaking on the phone in English. Her accent, it was too perfect for someone who says they've never left the United States." Richard nodded, absorbing the information. His housekeeper was proving to be a valuable ally in this silent investigation. "Martha, you said you recognize her from somewhere. Keep trying to remember. It could be important." At night, while working, in his office, Richard was surprised by soft sounds coming from the old music room, a room that had remained closed since his wife's passing. He silently approached and found Emily seated at the piano, her fingers gliding over the keys without pressing them, as if memorizing their position. "Looking for something specific?" he asked, making her jump in fright. "Oh, I'm sorry," she exclaimed, rising quickly. "The door was open and I've always been fascinated by antique pianos. This is a wonderful Steinway." "It was my wife's favorite," Richard commented, studying her reaction. "She used to play Rachmaninoff on it every morning." An imperceptible shadow passed over Emily's face. Rachmaninoff, the Concerto No. 2 in C minor, perhaps. Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. That was, in fact, his late wife's favorite piece, but he hadn't mentioned that. "Exactly," he replied, keeping his voice controlled. "How did you guess?" "Oh, it's one of his most famous pieces," Emily replied quickly, but her face had paled slightly. "A lucky guess." That night, after Emily retired, Richard remained in his office, reviewing the discoveries of the last few days. His private investigator had sent the first information. There was no record of any Emily Parker teaching music in schools in the region in recent years. In fact, the only record found of an Emily Parker with a compatible age was of a woman who had died 3 years earlier. While contemplating this information, a baby's cry broke the silence of the night. Richard realized that despite all his suspicions about Emily, he had developed a genuine affection for Michael. The baby had something in his gaze that deeply touched him, awakening paternal feelings he never knew he possessed. The sound of footsteps in the corridor caught his attention. Through the crack in the door, he saw Emily hurriedly pass by, carrying Michael. She didn't head to the bedroom, as expected, but to the library. Richard waited a few minutes before following her silently. The library door was ajar, and the faint light of a lamp created dancing shadows on the bookshelves. Emily was standing in front of a specific section, her fingers running over the spines of the books, while gently rocking Michael in her arms. Richard observed, intrigued, how she seemed to be looking for something specific, something that only someone very familiar with that library would know where to find. Suddenly, she removed an old volume from the shelf, a photo album that Richard hadn't seen in years. His heart raced as he recognized the object. It was his wife's personal album, where she kept her most intimate memories. How did Emily know exactly where to find it? Before he could confront her, Michael let out a small moan, and Emily quickly replaced the album on the shelf, leaving the library. Richard waited until her footsteps receded before entering and examining the album. The pages were slightly misaligned, indicating that someone had recently handled it. The next morning brought an unexpected revelation. Martha, with trembling hands and a pale face, knocked on the door of Richard's office even before breakfast was served. "Sir, I need to speak with you urgently," she whispered, closing the door behind her. "I finally remembered where I saw that girl before." Richard set aside the documents he was analyzing, giving his housekeeper his full attention. Martha pulled from her pocket an old, yellowed photograph. "I found this last night when I was organizing some old albums." The photograph showed his wife's funeral 5 years ago. Among the people paying their last respects, partially hidden by a black umbrella, was Emily. Her face was younger but unmistakable, observing the ceremony with an intense expression. "She was there," Martha continued, her voice trembling slightly. "And that's not all. In the months before, when Mrs. Harrison was ill, I occasionally saw her at the hospital. Always from a distance, always observing." Richard felt the weight of this revelation like a physical blow. His mind began to work frantically, connecting dots that previously seemed disconnected. Emily's knowledge of classical music, her familiarity with the mansion, the locket she wore. "Martha, I need you to keep this discovery in absolute secrecy," he instructed, storing the photograph in his drawer. "Continue acting normally with Emily. Don't let on that you know anything." That afternoon, Richard decided to test Emily in a more direct manner. During lunch, he casually mentioned, "You know, Emily, I was recalling the last days of my wife in the hospital. You remind me of her in some way. Perhaps it's the way you smile." Emily's fork trembled imperceptibly, but her voice remained controlled. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Harrison. Your wife must have been a very special person." "Yes, she was," he continued, carefully observing each reaction. "She loved white roses and always wore a specific perfume. What was its name again? Ah yes, Winter Garden, a very rare French fragrance." Emily visibly paled. Richard had never mentioned the name of the perfume. It was a detail known only to people very close to his late wife. "It must be difficult losing someone like that," Emily commented, trying to regain her composure. "Time heals all wounds, they say." "Not all of them," Richard replied significantly. "Some wounds merely transform into mysteries that demand solutions." The rest of lunch passed in tense silence. Emily seemed lost in thoughts, occasionally casting nervous glances at Michael, who slept peacefully in his stroller. In the afternoon, Richard received a call from his private investigator. "Mr. Harrison, I discovered something interesting about the woman you asked me to investigate. She worked at St. Luke's Hospital 5 years ago as an administrative assistant in the special treatments wing, the same wing where his wife had spent her last days." The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, but he still needed to understand the complete picture. During dinner, Richard noticed that Emily seemed more agitated than normal. Her fingers drummed nervously on the table, and she checked her cell phone with unusual frequency. "Any problem, Emily?" he asked, serving himself wine. No, just worried about Michael. He seems a bit feverish today," she replied, but her eyes avoided his. Later, while walking the corridors of the mansion, Richard heard Emily on the phone again. "I can't continue like this. He's beginning to suspect." "No, you don't understand. There are things you don't know about this whole story." Her voice sounded different, no longer the frightened young woman who had arrived during the storm, but a determined and possibly dangerous woman. That night, unable to sleep, Richard searched his office for any document that might have been compromised. It was then that he found, hidden among old folders, an envelope he didn't recognize. Inside were a series of old photographs of his wife, photos he had never seen before. The images showed his wife in various moments of the last months of her life, always discreetly accompanied by Emily. In one of the photos, the two were talking intimately in a cafe. In another, his wife was giving something to Emily, an object that appeared to be the same locket the young woman now wore. The most disturbing discovery, however, was in a note on the back of one of the photographs, written in his wife's Unmistakable handwriting. When the time is right, she will know what to do. Trust her, Richard. The businessman sat heavily in his armchair, feeling the weight of a mystery much greater than he had initially imagined. His wife not only knew Emily, but apparently had planned something with her. The question was, what? As he contemplated these revelations, a soft sound of music began to play upstairs. It was Rachmaninoff, the Concerto No. 2 in C minor, performed with a precision that could only come from someone deeply familiar with the piece. Emily was at his late wife's piano, playing the music exactly as she used to play. Dawn brought with it an atmosphere charged with tension. Richard had spent the night awake, analyzing the photographs found and trying to decipher the enigma his wife had left behind. The music of Rachmaninoff still echoed in his mind, played with the same emotion that his late wife used to bring to the piano keys. During breakfast, Emily appeared with deep dark circles, suggesting that she too hadn't slept well. Michael, however, seemed more cheerful than ever, letting out small sounds of contentment while playing with a silver spoon. "The baby seems happy today," Richard commented, observing how the little one's eyes shone in a way that was strangely familiar to him. "He's always like this when he feels comfortable in a place," Emily replied, her fingers gently caressing the baby's hair. "Sometimes I think he feels more than we adults are able to perceive." Martha entered the dining room with a worried expression. "Mr. Harrison, I just received a call from the office. It seems there has been a leak of information about the North Carolina beachfront project." Richard frowned. The project was confidential, known only to a select group of people. How could sensitive information have leaked? His eyes instinctively turned to Emily, who kept her attention focused on Michael. "I need to resolve this immediately," he said, rising. "Emily, can we talk later? There are some matters I'd like to discuss with you." "Of course," she replied, her voice betraying a slight hesitation. "I'll be in the garden with Michael during the afternoon." In the office, the news was even more serious than Martha had indicated. Not only had information about the project leaked, but specific details of negotiations that only someone with inside access could know were circulating among his competitors. While reviewing urgent reports, Richard received an unexpected call from his investigator. "Mr. Harrison, I discovered something intriguing about the period when your wife was hospitalized. There was a nurse who especially cared for her during the nights. The name wasn't Emily Parker, but the physical description matches perfectly." Richard felt his heart accelerate. "Were you able to discover the true name of this nurse?" "Not yet, sir. The records from that time are incomplete. But there's more. We found evidence that your wife received frequent visits from a young woman in the last months. The hospital security cameras show long conversations between them." Through the office window, Richard could see Emily in the garden with Michael. She walked among the rose bushes that his wife had so loved, occasionally stopping to touch the white petals with a disconcerting familiarity. Martha entered the office with more documents. "Sir, I found this among the madam's old correspondence," she said, handing him a yellowed envelope. "I thought you should see it." Inside the envelope was an unfinished letter, written by his wife a few weeks before her departure. The words, though shaky, revealed surprising lucidity. "My dear Richard, when you read this letter, many things will have changed. There are secrets I've carried with me for years, truths that need to come to light at the right time. The young woman I met here at the hospital, she is more important than you can imagine. She carries with her a part of our history that—" The letter ended abruptly there, as if his wife had been interrupted or hadn't found the strength to continue. A scream from the garden tore Richard from his thoughts. Running to the window, he saw Emily crouched near the rose bushes, holding Michael firmly against her chest. Her face was pale, and she was staring fixedly at something on the ground. When Richard reached the garden, he found Emily trembling. At her feet was an old gold locket, the same one his wife had worn for years, and that had supposedly been buried with her. "How did this get here?" he asked, his voice barely containing the emotion. Emily raised her eyes, tears streaming down her face. "I think it's time to tell the truth, Mr. Harrison. But it's not a simple truth. It's a story that began long before that stormy night." Michael, still in Emily's arms, extended his small hand toward the locket as if recognizing the object. His eyes, so similar to someone Richard had known in the past, shone with a wisdom beyond his age. Richard led Emily and Michael to the mansion's library, a place his wife had always considered sacred. The walls lined with books seemed to hold not only knowledge, but also the secrets that were about to be revealed. The locket, found in the garden, rested on the mahogany table, its golden shine capturing the afternoon light that entered through the tall windows. "Before I begin," Emily said, adjusting Michael in her lap, "I need you to understand that everything I did was following specific instructions from your wife, Claire. She planned each detail, each moment." Richard sat in his favorite armchair, the same one where he used to read to Claire on winter nights. "Why did she never tell me about you?" Emily took a deep breath, her fingers absently caressing Michael's hair. "Because the truth wasn't just about me. It was about something much larger, something she discovered in her last months of life. During the day, I worked as an administrative assistant at the hospital," Emily continued, her voice now firmer. "But Claire specifically chose me to be her night companion. She had recognized me, even though I didn't know it at the time." Richard furrowed his brow. "Recognized from where?" "From an old photograph she kept in her personal planner. A photograph of your son, Mr. Harrison, a son you never knew existed." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard felt the world spin around him, his hands gripping the arms of the chair tightly. "What son?" "Before meeting you, Claire, had a brief relationship with a young musician. When she discovered she was pregnant, he had already left on a European tour. She decided to give the child up for adoption, as she had no means to raise him alone at the time. That baby was my husband, Luke." Emily's words hit Richard like successive waves, each more impactful than the last. Claire had never mentioned a son, never given any indication that she carried this secret. "Luke grew up in a loving adoptive family," Emily continued, her voice choked with emotion. "He became a talented pianist, unconsciously following in his biological father's footsteps. It was through music that we met, fell in love, and married." Michael let out a small sigh in his sleep, and Emily cuddled him closer. Claire discovered Luke's existence by chance, through an investigation she conducted when she began thinking about her will. She found the adoption records and spent years following his life from a distance, never having the courage to approach. Richard stood up, walking to the window. His legs were trembling. "And why did she decide to tell you?" "Because her time was running out, and she had discovered that Luke had suffered a serious accident. She sought me out at the hospital when she learned I worked there. At that time I was pregnant with Michael." Emily paused, silent tears streaming down her face. "Claire spent hours talking with me during her nights at the hospital. She wanted to know every detail of Luke's life, wanted to know what kind of man her son had become." Richard turned abruptly. "Michael is my grandson?" Emily nodded, a sad smile on her lips. "Yes, and there's more. Claire made a request before leaving. She made me promise to find a way to bring Michael into your life. She didn't want you to continue alone, and she believed that Michael would be the bridge to heal old wounds." "The locket," Richard murmured, picking up the golden object on the table. "Why was it buried with her if it's now here?" "It wasn't," Emily answered softly. "Claire gave me the locket on the last night we talked. Inside it is a letter for you and some photographs of Luke as a child. She wanted me to keep it until the right moment." With trembling hands, Richard opened the locket. Indeed, there was a carefully folded letter and some old photographs. In one of them, a boy of approximately 5 years smiled at the camera, seated at the piano. His eyes, the same eyes as Michael, shone with a pure joy that Richard recognized from photographs of his own childhood. "Why all this elaboration?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Why not simply tell me the truth?" Emily adjusted, herself in the armchair, her face assuming a serious expression. "Claire had a specific plan. She knew you would need time to process all of this. More than that, she wanted you to meet Michael, to create a bond with him before knowing the truth. She feared that If you knew immediately, you might close yourself off in your pain and reject this connection. Richard looked at Michael, sleeping peacefully. Now he could see clearly Claire's features, his own features, mixed in that small, innocent face. A wave of love and protection invaded him, so strong that it almost made him stagger. And all those documents I saw in your room? The plans of the mansion, the information about my business. Emily blushed slightly. Part of Claire's plan. She gave me access to all of this, wanted me to fully understand the world you live in before approaching you. Emily hesitated for a moment. She also wanted to ensure your business was protected. That's why she instructed me to monitor certain suspicious activities she had noticed before leaving. The revelation about suspicious business activities brought a new dimension to the conversation. Richard leaned forward, his expression changing from emotion to concern. What suspicious activities? Emily gently placed Michael in the small crib they had brought to the library. Claire discovered during her last months that someone close to you was systematically diverting resources from the company. She began to discreetly investigate, but didn't have time to complete her investigation. Martha, Richard murmured, the pieces finally fitting together. That's why she's been acting so strangely since your arrival. Yes, Emily confirmed. Martha didn't recognize me from the hospital because she never saw me there. She avoided the night hours when I was with Claire, but she knew that Claire had discovered something. That's why she began to monitor my activities so closely since I arrived. Richard stood up, walking to the bookshelf where he kept the oldest records of his business. So all those coded calls I heard were to a private investigator that Claire had hired, Emily completed. I continued her work, following her instructions. She left a complete file detailing her suspicions and the evidence she had collected. At that moment, a soft knock at the door interrupted the conversation. Martha entered, carrying a tray with tea. Her face visibly paled at seeing the locket on the table. I thought you might like some tea, she said, her voice trembling slightly. It's a cold afternoon. Martha, Richard spoke, his voice laden with authority. I think you have something to tell us. The housekeeper set the tray on the table, her hands visibly trembling. Mr. Harrison, I can explain. Can you really? Emily gently intervened, removing an envelope from her purse. Claire kept detailed records of all the suspicious transfers. She trusted you, Martha. She considered you part of the family. Martha collapsed into a nearby armchair, tears streaming down her aged face. Mrs. Harrison, she discovered everything a few weeks before she left. She confronted me, but instead of reporting me, she gave me a chance to fix things. Richard sat down again, feeling the weight of this additional revelation. Why, Martha? After so many years? My son, she sobbed. He got involved with dangerous. People owed a lot of money. They threatened to harm my granddaughter if I didn't help. At first they were small amounts, but it grew. Emily stood up, approaching Martha with a compassionate expression. Claire knew about this. That's why she developed a plan to protect not only Mr. Harrison's business, but also to help your family, Martha. What are you talking about? Richard and Martha asked almost simultaneously. In the will that Claire left, there is a specific clause. She created a fund to help employees in financial difficulty, especially those with family at risk. Martha, she wanted to help you, but needed to first ensure that all illegal activities ceased. Martha covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. I didn't deserve such kindness, not after what I did. Claire believed that everyone deserves a second chance, Emily said softly. That's what she taught me during our conversations at the hospital. That's what she wanted to demonstrate with her elaborate plan to reunite this family. Richard stood up, approaching the crib where Michael slept. The baby had awakened and was watching him with his bright eyes, so similar to Claire's. So that's why you were monitoring my communications and business meetings? Yes, Emily confirmed. We needed to ensure that no other person was involved in the scheme. Claire suspected there might be more people implicated, especially after discovering some suspicious documents in your office. And were there? Richard asked, although he already suspected the answer. Unfortunately, yes. Your minority partner, Robert Caldwell, was coordinating a much larger scheme. Martha was just a piece in an elaborate plan to divert significant resources from the company. Claire discovered this when she began investigating the suspicious transfers. The silence that followed was interrupted only by Michael's soft babbling. Richard picked up his grandson, feeling a wave of protection and love he had never experienced before. All of Claire's plan, all the elaborate plot she had architected, had a greater purpose than he could have imagined. The sun was beginning to set when Emily finally opened the letter that was kept in the locket. The golden afternoon light filtered through the library windows, creating dancing shadows on the walls as she carefully unfolded the yellowed paper. "Claire asked me to read this letter with you," Emily explained, her soft voice breaking the contemplative silence that had settled. She said this moment would need to be shared. Martha had retired to her quarters, still shaken by the previous conversation. Michael slept peacefully in his grandfather's lap, who seemed unable to separate from his grandson now that he knew the truth. Emily began to read, her voice choked with emotion. "My beloved Richard, if you are reading this letter, it means that Emily has managed to fulfill the promise she made to me. It also means that you have already met Michael, our precious grandson, and that your heart has already opened to this love that transcends all pain and secrets. I know you must be wondering why I kept so many secrets, why I never told you about Luke, why I waited so long to reveal the truth. The answer, my love, is as complex as it is simple. I was afraid of your reaction, afraid that this revelation might shake the happiness we built together. Luke was the result of a young and inexperienced love, a chapter in my life that happened long before I met you. When I discovered I was pregnant, I was alone and frightened. The decision to give our son up for adoption was the most difficult I ever made, but at the time it seemed the only possible option. Years passed, I met you, and our life together was happier than I ever dreamed possible. But Luke's absence was always a shadow in my heart. When I finally found him, through an investigation I initiated when preparing my will, I discovered that he had become a talented musician, like his biological father, like I always dreamed of being. Emily entered my life as a gift from destiny. She worked at the hospital, and upon discovering she was Luke's wife, I felt that I could finally do something to correct the mistakes of the past. I spent my last months getting to know our daughter-in-law, discovering through her the wonderful man our son had become. But there was more at stake than just family secrets. During my investigations to find Luke, I discovered irregularities in the company's business. Someone close to us was using our trust for dubious purposes. I couldn't leave with you vulnerable to these threats. So I devised a plan. Emily, with her intelligence and dedication, would be not only the link to bring Michael into your life, but also your eyes and ears in the investigation that needed to be completed. Every document she studied, every conversation she monitored, every detail she observed was following my meticulous instructions. Martha, our dear Martha. When I discovered her involvement, my heart broke. But upon understanding her motives, the threat hanging over her family, I realized she too was a victim. That's why I created the assistance fund in my will. Everyone deserves a second chance, Richard. You taught me that throughout our years together. Now, my love, I ask you to open your heart, not only to Michael, but also to Emily. She carries with her not only our grandson, but also a bit of our son's soul. Luke may no longer be among us, but through Michael, his legacy will continue to live. There is one last thing I need to tell you. In the safe behind the sunflower painting, the one you always thought I didn't know the combination to, I left a blue folder with all the evidence I collected about suspicious activities in the company. Emily has been helping to keep this information updated. Use it wisely. I hope that one day you can forgive me for keeping so many secrets. Everything I did was out of love. Love for you, for Luke, for our family. And now, through Michael, that love will continue to live. With all my heart, Claire. Richard remained silent for long moments after Emily finished reading. Silent tears ran down his face as he contemplated his grandson in his arms. Finally, He raised his eyes to Emily. "The safer," he murmured. "How did she know the combination?" Emily smiled softly. "It was Luke's date of birth. Claire told me that you always used important dates as passwords. She surmised that, unconsciously, you chose that date for some reason that even you didn't understand." Richard stood up carefully, still holding Michael. "I think it's time we opened that safe. We need to end this story once and for all." "Are you sure you want to do this now?" Emily asked, concern evident in her voice. "Claire planned all of this meticulously," Richard replied, his voice firm. Despite the emotions that dominated him, she wanted the truth to come to light at the right time, and that time is now. Together, they headed to the sunflower painting that dominated one of the library walls. Emily carried the locket, now no longer an object of mystery, but a tangible symbol of the connection between past and present. The safe opened with a soft click when Richard entered the date, March 15th, 1990. The day Luke was born, a day he never knew had so profoundly marked his life. Inside the safe, besides the blue folder mentioned in Claire's letter, was a green velvet box he had never seen before. "Claire told me about this box," Emily said softly. "She prepared it especially for this moment." Richard placed Michael, who was still sleeping in the nearby crib, and took the box with trembling hands. Inside, he found a series of photographs, letters, and documents carefully organized in chronological order. It was the complete story of Luke, from his birth to his last days. "Claire began collecting these memories as soon as she found Luke," Emily explained, sitting beside Richard. "She followed his life from a distance, keeping every newspaper clipping about his concerts, every presentation program. The photographs showed a young man with a bright smile and expressive eyes, seated at the piano in different auditoriums around the world. In one particularly touching image, Luke was standing next to Emily at their wedding, both radiant with happiness. He was extraordinary," Emily said, her voice choked with emotion. "He had a natural gift for music, as if it flowed directly from his soul. When we met during a masterclass in Vienna, it was as if we instantly recognized each other." Richard observed each photograph attentively, absorbing the details of the son he never knew. "He looked so much like Claire, but I see some of my features too." "Michael is identical to him as a baby," Emily commented, smiling through tears. Claire had a photo of Luke as a newborn. When she saw Michael for the first time in the hospital, she said it was like going back in time. While examining the contents of the box, Richard found a golden USB drive with a small handwritten label by Claire, "For when you're ready." Emily immediately recognized the object. "Claire told me about this. These are recordings of Luke playing piano. She managed to collect records of several of his concerts over the years." Richard stood up and walked to his laptop on the desk. His hands trembled slightly as he inserted the USB drive. After a few moments, the library was filled with the soft chords of Rachmaninoff's Concerto No. 2, the same piece that Claire had so loved, now interpreted by her son. "This was his last performance," Emily whispered, 3 weeks before the accident. The music flowed with overwhelming emotion, each note laden with feeling. Richard closed his eyes, allowing himself to be enveloped by the melody. It was as if Claire were there again, as if all the years of absence and secrets dissolved in the piano notes. Michael chose this moment to wake up, his small eyes opening to the sound of the music. Instead of crying, he remained silent, as if recognizing the melody played by his father. "Claire was right," Richard said, picking up his grandson. "Some things are beyond our rational understanding. The way this baby reacts to music, how he seems to carry the essence of Luke and Claire. It's something mystical." "She also told me something important," Emily added, opening the blue folder containing evidence about irregularities in the company. Claire believed that everything was connected: the music, the business, the secrets. She said that to heal a wound, sometimes you need to expose all of them. Together, they began to examine the documents compiled by Claire. The evidence was irrefutable. Robert Caldwell, the minority partner, had built an elaborate network of diversions and fraud, using vulnerable employees like Martha to execute his orders. Claire discovered all of this while investigating Luke, Emily explained. It was as if the universe conspired for all truth to come to light at the same time. As they reviewed the documents, Michael played with the locket, his small hand grasping the golden object as if understanding its importance. The sun had completely set, and the library was illuminated only by the desk lamp and the soft light of the laptop, from which Luke's music still emanated. "Tomorrow," Richard finally said, his voice loaded with determination, "we'll put an end to this entire story. Robert needs to face the consequences of his actions, but we'll do it the right way. Claire gave us all the necessary tools." Emily nodded, understanding the moral strength behind that decision. Claire always said that true justice doesn't come from revenge, but from correcting mistakes with wisdom and compassion. The next morning dawned with a different clarity in the mansion. Richard, who hadn't been able to sleep, was watching the sunrise from his veranda when Emily approached with Michael in her arms. The baby smiled, oblivious to the importance of the day that was beginning. "Are you ready?" Emily asked softly, adjusting Michael in her arms. Richard nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Claire always said that dawn brings with it the possibility of new beginnings. Today I fully understand what she meant. After breakfast, Richard convened an extraordinary meeting of his company's administrative council. Emily would stay at the mansion with Michael, monitoring everything according to the plan they had devised during the early hours. Martha, still shaken by the events of the previous day, had agreed to collaborate fully. At the company's central office, the atmosphere was one of veiled tension. Robert Caldwell, elegant in his Italian suit, displayed his usual confident smile, completely unaware of what was coming. The other board members settled in the meeting room, while Richard methodically organized a series of folders on the table. "Gentlemen," Richard began, his voice calm but firm, "I called this meeting to discuss some important discoveries about the management of our resources in recent years." Robert adjusted himself in his chair, a slight frown betraying his first demonstration of concern. "Something specific in mind, Richard?" "Actually, yes." Richard opened the first folder, revealing a series of documents meticulously organized by Claire. "My late wife, before leaving, left an invaluable gift for this company, a complete investigation into a scheme to divert resources that has been operating for years." The silence that followed was deafening. Robert maintained his composure, but his fingers drumming on the table betrayed his growing nervousness. "Claire was always very imaginative," Robert commented, trying to keep a light tone. "Perhaps she misinterpreted some perfectly normal accounting procedures, like systematic transfers to offshore accounts in the name of shell companies," Richard asked, sliding some bank statements across the table. "Or perhaps the coercion of employees in vulnerable situations to participate in the scheme." At the mansion, Emily was following the meeting through a discreet video conference installed in Richard's office. Michael played quietly on the rug beside her, occasionally letting out small sounds of contentment that seemed in tune with the unfolding events. Back in the meeting room, Robert had completely lost his mask of tranquility. "This is absurd. You have no proof?" "I have all the necessary proof, Robert," Richard interrupted, his voice now laden with authority. "Every document, every transfer, every threat made to employees. Claire not only discovered everything, but also ensured that this evidence was preserved and updated." The other board members observed the scene with a mixture of shock and indignation. Richard continued, his voice firm, "But we're not here to seek revenge. Claire taught me, even after her departure, that there are more constructive ways to deal with betrayals." Robert, now visibly pale, tried to stand up, but two security guards discreetly positioned near the door made clear the futility of any attempt to escape. "You have two options, Robert," Richard continued, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You can voluntarily resign from your position, return every diverted cent and collaborate with a complete audit, or we can take this to the appropriate authorities. The choice is yours." At the mansion, Emily held Claire's locket, silent tears running down her face as she watched the scene unfold. Michael, as if sensing the importance of the moment, had stopped playing and was staring fixedly at the computer screen. Robert Caldwell, finally stripped of his arrogance, let his shoulders fall in defeat. How did you discover everything? Claire was always more observant than any of us imagined, Richard replied. When she began investigating the whereabouts of certain important people in her life, she ended up discovering your illicit activities. She transformed her pain into purpose, protecting not only the company but also those you manipulated and threatened. One by one, the board members began to express their support for Richard. The room filled with voices determined to correct the mistakes of the past and rebuild the company's reputation on more solid foundations. At the mansion, Martha silently entered the office, bringing a cup of tea for Emily. The housekeeper now, free from the weight of her own secrets, had found a new determination to help rebuild the trust that had been broken. Mrs. Harrison always said that family isn't just blood, Martha commented softly, watching Michael. It's also about redemption and second chances. Emily nodded, picking up Michael. She planned all of this not just to expose the truth, but to create opportunities for healing for everyone involved. A year passed since that decisive morning. The mansion, once silent and somber, now overflowed with life and music. Michael's crystalline laughter echoed through the corridors, mixing with the melodies that occasionally flowed from the piano in the music room, now frequently played by Emily. Richard watched his grandson take his first steps in the garden among the white rose bushes that Claire had so loved. The flowers, once neglected, had been reborn with surprising vigor, as if responding to the new energy that permeated the property. The company had recovered from the scandal with remarkable resilience. Robert Caldwell fulfilled his part of the agreement, returning all diverted resources and collaborating with the administrative restructuring. Martha, freed from her old chains, had become an even more valuable ally in managing the mansion. On this particular afternoon, the mansion was especially busy. It was the one-year anniversary of Emily and Michael's arrival, and Richard had organized a small celebration. The garden was decorated with delicate lights and soft classical music. Recordings of Luke filled the environment. "Mr. Harrison," Emily called, approaching with an envelope in her hands. "I found this morning when organizing some of Claire's old belongings." It was a letter still sealed with that exact date written on the front. Claire, in her infinite wisdom, had prepared a special message for this occasion. "My dears," the letter said, "if you are reading this, it means that a year has passed since fate and a bit of planning united our family. Richard, my love, I hope you now understand why I needed to orchestrate everything this way. Sometimes the most important truths need to be discovered gradually, like a melody that develops note by note." Richard needed to pause, his vision blurred by tears. Emily continued reading. "Emily, my dear, you were not only the guardian of my secrets, but you became the daughter I never had. Take care of Richard and Michael with the same love and dedication you showed during our conversations at the hospital. And Michael, my precious grandson, although I couldn't meet you personally, I know you carry within you the best of all of us, Luke's music, Emily's strength, and Richard's heart." Michael, as if understanding they were talking about him, let out a joyful laugh, his small fingers trying to reach the butterflies dancing among the flowers. "Life is like a grand symphony," the letter continued. "Each moment, each person, each decision is a note that contributes to the final melody. Our mistakes and successes, our joys and sorrows, all intertwined to create something greater than ourselves." Richard picked up Michael, feeling the comforting warmth of his small body. "Claire was right," he said softly. "All of this, the investigation, the secrets, your arrival during that storm, was part of a greater composition." Emily smiled. Touching the locket she still carried with her, "She transformed our pain into something beautiful. Luke would be proud." At that moment, as if the universe wanted to confirm these words, a light breeze stirred the rose bushes, scattering white petals across the garden. Michael laughed, trying to catch them in the air, his eyes shining with the same light that Claire used to have. "I'm going to create a foundation," Richard suddenly announced, "in Claire and Luke's name, to help talented young musicians and single mothers in difficulty." Emily nodded, moved. Claire would love that. It was exactly the kind of legacy she would want to leave. The afternoon advanced gently, lulled by Luke's music and Michael's laughter. The mansion, once a monument to Richard's loneliness, had been transformed into a true home where past and present intertwined in perfect harmony. Martha served the anniversary cake, her serene expression reflecting the peace of someone who had finally found redemption. The candles were lit, not only to celebrate 1 year since Emily and Michael's arrival, but to illuminate the path ahead. To family, Richard toasted, raising his glass, not just the one that blood gives us, but the one that love builds. To Claire, Emily added, who wove this plot with threads of love and wisdom. Michael, in his high chair, clapped happily as if approving every word. On the piano in the music room, Luke's recording played softly Rachmaninoff's Concerto No. 2, the notes flowing like a river of memories and promises. And so, under the sky that was beginning to be tinged with the colors of sunset, the story, that had begun on a stormy night, found its true meaning. Not an ending, but a new beginning, a new melody to be composed, day after day, note after note, love after love.